Okay, so yesterday we were talking about primary succession, where I was using the example of a retreating glacier and how plant species come in, and there's four kind of stages here, and the plant species get larger and larger and larger until eventually you get kind of what's called your climax community at the end. And why it can support larger species towards the end and not towards the beginning is because of the soil nitrogen content. So remember that nitrogen is used by plants to build proteins and nucleic acids. And so plants get that source of nitrogen from the soil. And so at the very beginning, there's not much nitrogen, so it can't support a lot of plants, and they're very small. Then as these plants die and decompose, it adds nitrogen to the soil, so the nitrogen content gets greater, and it can support larger plants, and so on and so forth as you go through, okay? And so that's where we left off. So that was primary succession. Secondary succession begins in an area where soil remains after a disturbance. So this would be like the fire example I used yesterday with Yellowstone. It's also an example would be if a farmer abandoned his land in terms of decided not to grow a crop anymore and just left it. What would happen is seeds would blow in from surrounding areas. Those seeds would sprout and new plants would grow, and over many, many years you'd end up with an ecosystem that was similar to the surrounding ecosystems as well. All right, and that would be secondary succession because organisms have lived on that land before. We as humans have a big impact on communities. We are the species that has the greatest impact on biological communities. Both land, terrestrial, and marine ocean ecosystems are subject to human disturbances. Terrestrial land ecosystems, how would we affect a land or disturb a land ecosystem? Deforestation. So yes, we cut down trees, absolutely. And a marine ecosystem, how would we affect? Overfishing, absolutely. And so remember with the food webs, if you overfish one particular species, it can have effect on many different species because of the feeding relationships. So overfishing is a big one. Oil spills would be a big one. This is trawling. Trawling is when a boat pulls a net and it kind of drags along the floor and then takes up basically everything there. And so that's what we see here. So this is before, after, so it pretty much destroys the ecosystem. So that is one example there.
Why should do that? Why is that?
Why is that bad?
Yeah, well, like, why do they even do that?
They're fishing, getting fish. This is a easy way to get a large quantity of things. And the people doing it don't care about all the other stuff. They're taking it. All right, so in looking at diversity on the Earth, latitude and area, so where the ecosystems are factors that affect species diversity. So let's look at latitude. Species richness, remember that's the number of different types of species, is greatest in the tropics and declines as you go towards the poles. So for instance, in the tropical rainforest has very rich species diversity, species richness. And then as you go like to Antarctica, there's fewer numbers of organisms, different types of organisms, the diversity goes down. All right, and so the reasons probably evolutionary history and climate. So let's look at temperate and polar. So as you go away from the tropics, temperate is kind of like an intermediate between the tropics and the polar communities. Have started over repeatedly following glaciation. So a glacier comes over, and then when the glacier retreats, the succession has to occur, and it has to be repopulated. Whereas the tropical environments, the greater age of tropical environments accounts for greater species richness, because the tropical environments really, based upon where they're at, they haven't had glaciations, and therefore the overtaking of glaciers, the retreating of glaciers, and so on. So they really haven't started over. And so when we think about natural selection and evolution and speciation, that the longer the environment has been around, the more divergence in terms of different species that can be found. And plus, the tropics has a longer growing region per year because of its weather. And so here's just a visual of the tropics, all right, highlighted here. So that's what we're talking about, the most diverse ecosystems. And then climate is also plays a role. It's the likely primary cause of the latitudinal gradient. Two factors that play a role that are important in climate are sunlight and precipitation. And so we can consider them together in this thing called evapotranspiration. It's a combination of two different words, evaporation and transpiration. So evaporation of water from the soil, so water goes is evaporated into the atmosphere. That will help with precipitation as well as humidity and so on. Transpiration of water from plants. Remember way back when we talked about water and plants, remember water can hydrogen bond to one another? And remember when water goes into a plant through the roots, then the water forms this whole chain of water molecules that are all hydrogen bonded together, goes to the branches, and then the leaves, remember the leaves have holes, the stomata on the bottom that open and close, and when they're open, gas exchange can occur, but also water can evaporate. That evaporation of water from plants is called transpiration. So it's another way to get water into the atmosphere. And it's a good thing, some of it is a good thing for the plant because when the water evaporates, remember that water molecules is hydrogen bonded to all the other water molecules, so you have a chain. And so when this water molecule evaporates, it pulls the rest of them up, and so that's how water gets up the plant. And so the precipitation has to do with both the evaporation from water from the soil and transpiration of plants. And so that's why if you go into a greenhouse, it's always really humid, right? You go in a greenhouse, very humid, because all those plants are transpiring. They're doing transpiration. And so they're letting water out, and it's really humid in there. And so here we have the correlation. More evaporation or evapotranspiration, the greater diversity, the greater species richness. All right, and so that's what this is. All right, it's exciting because that's the end. We're going to stop for this chapter, so you can don't worry about the rest of it. Making your day here. Yeah, you can rip it off if you'd like. Yes. Oh yes. Remember, I accidentally made the wrong copy. Not even the last page. Woo! What about the graph? The one that we just went over? Yeah, that's right there.
I just got back from the work.
Oh, okay. Okay. All right, so we're going to go right on to the next page.
I feel like in a food, like those things, but yeah, it would be. Like, would I choose? No. If I did a gourmet chef, like, maybe we should shop, but those could be in China. But the wasabi out.
So we have been kind of building up. We talked about 2 chapters ago was about population, so all individuals that belong to the same species. Then we talked about communities where different populations of different species live together and interact with one another. And this last thing is just about ecosystems, which is the community, so all the living organisms, all the different species, as well as their abiotic factors. All right, and so all the non-living parts of their place that they live. And so introduced species, another way to say introduced species is using what word? Invasive species. Can have dramatic effects on both the living and the non-living components of an ecosystem. Why? Why can an invasive species, how does it affect? Absolutely, absolutely. So lack of predators because they're not naturally there. Ecosystems, when defining and looking at an ecosystem, it can be very small. So it says here a microcosm, like a fallen tree log. So under a fallen tree log, you might have a whole little ecosystem where you have different insects and so on that live there. Or it could be something very large, like an island or a lake or something like that. So an ecosystem can be defined by the person studying. So like for instance, a fallen log, you can, if that's what you want to look at as your ecosystem, you can look at that in isolation. But usually that can also be part of a larger ecosystem, like the whole forest ecosystem that it's part of. So the person researching it can define the size of the ecosystem. So there's an island and a desert ecosystem and so on. But regardless of its size, there are two things that we look at in studying ecosystems. Two main processes: energy flow and chemical cycling. So energy flows through ecosystems while matter cycles within ecosystems. So that's what we talked about yesterday with the energy flow, like with the food chain. So matter flows from, energy flows into an ecosystem. The energy coming into an ecosystem is the sunlight, and then that's absorbed by the producer. The producer converts the energy to the energy in glucose. Then the consumer eats that, and so on and so forth, and energy flows through the ecosystems. We're going to talk a little bit about chemical cycling today. So chemicals cycle, matter cycles within an ecosystem. So energy flows through while matter cycles. An example of matter cycling through the ecosystem that you may be familiar with, I know you've learned before, is like the water cycle. Remember, do you guys remember that? The water cycle, how it cycles through. And so that's an example. So this first section, the first little part of this, kind of pulls in way back from chapter 6, where we talked about energy transformations and the laws of thermodynamics. We're going to kind of relate this to ecosystems as well. So study of energy, transformation of energy and matter within ecosystems. So conservation of energy, laws of physics and chemistry applied to ecosystems, in particular energy flow. So remember the first law of thermodynamics. Energy cannot be created nor destroyed, only transformed. So as I just said, energy enters an ecosystem as solar radiation, is conserved, and is lost from organisms as heat. So remember that when it's lost from organisms as heat, remember that when we eat a plant or eat something that ate a plant, that's how we get our glucose. And we use our glucose for energy. So we break it down to get energy to make ATP. Well, remember, some of that, we're not 100% efficient. So all that energy in the glucose, only a small portion of it goes to actually make ATP. The most of it is released as heat, right? And so, so when it's released as heat, we had this energy stored in glucose. Now that energy is converted to heat. So we've gone from a very orderly form of energy, the chemical energy in glucose, to a lot of heat, which is disorderly. So we would say that what increases in the universe? Entropy. Entropy is another way to say, like, the disorder, right? Remember that? That's the second law. All right, so the second law of thermodynamics states that every energy exchange increases the entropy of the universe. So if you don't remember what entropy is, you might want to write here the disorder. And remember, we're not completely efficient, so some is lost as heat. Heat increases the disorder, right? Or increases the entropy. in looking at an ecosystem, we look at energy, but we also look at matter. So this is the conservation of mass. So the law of conservation of mass states that matter can be neither created or destroyed. So what they are recycled. So chemical elements are continually recycled. So the elements enter and then leave. All right, so they enter as dust or solutes in a forest ecosystem and carried away in water. So they enter. So therefore, ecosystems are in general open systems where we have energy and matter come into an ecosystem, and then we have energy and matter that leave the ecosystem. And therefore, so they absorb energy like the sunlight in mass, and then they release energy in the form of heat and waste products. That's the chemical cycling that we'll look at. So, and looking at an ecosystem, there are two main categories of organisms that you probably know these terms, I hope. Autotrophs, auto means self, a troph is feeding, so self-feeding organisms. They build molecules themselves using photosynthesis or chemosynthesis as an energy source. Heterotrophs, on the other hand, depend on other organisms for their energy. So they are organisms that eat other organisms. Let me talk a minute about chemosynthesis here. Most organisms that are autotrophs on Earth get their energy through photosynthesis. So they make their food through photosynthesis. There are some exceptions, this chemosynthetic organisms. So this would be, I think I've talked about this before, where like the community and a hydrothermal vent on the bottom of the ocean. So that it's deep enough where light can't get down there, so the light is filtered out, so it's in complete darkness. But yet you have this whole community of different organisms that live there. If you have a community of organisms that live there, you have to have a producer. But those producers on the bottom of the ocean, can they do photosynthesis? No, because there's no light there. So what they do is they use the energy in chemicals that are released from the hydrothermal vent and convert those to food. And then they get the food, the producers, and then you can support consumers and so on that eat those. All right, and so those are your autotrophs and heterotrophs. Oh, and the next bullet, I wanted you to fill in based upon what we talked about yesterday. So the blanks are the different trophic levels of the organisms to show the flow of energy. So go ahead and you should be able to fill those blanks in.
Wait, so does tertiaries? Okay. Well, they have tertiaries like other consumers. Yeah, is that what it says? So these, that, other carnivores, so it has to be.
primary producers, those are your autotrophs, to primary consumers, then to secondary consumers, and then to tertiary consumers, and sometimes there's a fifth level, and they would be the quaternary consumers, all right? But remember that there's not usually more than that because of the energy transfer, right, the loss. Let me point out here, when it says primary consumers and it says herbivores, herbivores are an example of primary consumers. Herbivores are always primary consumers because they always eat the producers. But you don't have to have an herbivore here. This is just an example. So like for instance, can we be a primary consumer? Yes, we can by eating your vegetables, right? So you are acting as a primary consumer. So I just want to point that out, that it doesn't always have to be an herbivore. Most people are omnivores that eat both plant and animal. All right, what we left out from yesterday when we talked about the food webs and food chains is what happens when we die. Detritivores or decomposers are consumers. They get their energy from detritus, which is non-living organic matter. All right, so that could be a dead animal carcass, it could be a rotting log, and so on. Prokaryotes, so bacteria and fungi are your main types of detritivores that decompose organic material. And this connects all trophic levels. So here we have a picture of bacteria. Here's spherical bacteria and rod-shaped bacteria and decomposing in a compost pile. Here is some fungus that are helping to decompose this tree here, dead tree. This picture here puts in a little bit of what we talked about yesterday, Roman and Gowan. A little bit of what we talked about yesterday and puts in the new material as well. So here's our food chain, where and notice here there's two things that are kind of moving or cycling around or flowing through this. Chemical cycling and energy flow. Let's look at energy flow first with the red. So because that's what we looked at yesterday. So the sunlight, energy from the sunlight comes in, gets absorbed by the primary producers. Primary producers then do photosynthesis and make their glucose. Then the primary consumers eat them, so the flow of energy goes here, then the secondary and tertiary. Notice here, out of each one of these here, we have arrows coming out, loss of heat, because what happens is all of those organisms do cellular respiration. So they do cellular respiration. Remember when we break down glucose, some of that energy is released as heat, so therefore that's what those are. Now what happens when all of these guys die is that they become a part of what we call detritus. So this is your dead organic material, and your microorganisms eat that and get energy from that, all right? So, and then they also release heat. So energy is flowing through the ecosystem and goes back into the atmosphere through the food chain here and goes back into the atmosphere as heat. So that's your energy flow. When we look at chemical cycling, let me give the example of, let me give a particular chemical we can use as an example to focus through this. Let's talk about carbon dioxide, or the carbon cycle. So, in the blue here, we're going to look at how carbon cycles through the ecosystem. So, look at here. Here's your primary producers. Here's an arrow to the primary producers. So, in what form of carbon do plants take carbon? In what form is carbon taken into by plants? CO2. So, we're talking about the carbon cycle. This is CO2. CO2 enters into the plant, right? And then the plant does what with CO2? Uses it to make glucose, right? So CO2 enters the producers. Now this carbon is in the form of glucose. So that's the carbon in glucose. Then following the blue arrow here, some of that glucose, remember, the producers use right away. Through what process? What process would the plants use glucose? Cellular respiration. When so the CO2 is going to become part of this through photosynthesis. The glucose, then, the carbon in glucose, when glucose is used in cellular respiration, notice here, some CO2 leaves. That's like us, we breathe out CO2, right? All right, so it goes back into the atmosphere, okay? So plants do both of those. But they store some of the glucose. So remember plants, when we talked about the relationship between photosynthesis and cellular respiration, plants in general do more photosynthesis than they do cellular respiration. Otherwise, we'd have trouble breathing. Because remember, plants give off oxygen, but they also use it for cellular respiration, and so we'd have no oxygen. So they have to do photosynthesis more. All right, so then the carbon is in glucose. The primary consumers eat the glucose. So now they have some glucose here, but then some of that glucose is used and CO2 enters back into the atmosphere through cellular respiration. So that's through cellular respiration using that glucose. Then the secondary and tertiary consumers eat the glucose, and now you have glucose here. But again, they use up some of that glucose, so we add CO2 into the atmosphere. And all of that CO2 can go back into the plants. So there's the cycling part. Now, that's when the organisms are alive. So now when all of these guys die, they form the detritus. So now all that carbon that's in the body of the organism, all of that carbon is now in this dead organic matter. So this is, so carbon compounds like glucose and so on that's in the body of the organism is now in this dead organic matter, which then the microorganisms can use, all right? And so the microorganisms use that, those carbon compounds. What do they use it now? So now the microorganisms get glucose, the carbon and the dead organic matter, and they use it for cellular respiration as well. So therefore, they do cellular respiration, which then puts more CO2 into the atmosphere, all right? And so what we have is this carbon cycle where it flows through the ecosystem through carbon dioxide and then carbon compounds within and so therefore we get this cycling. And so we just replenish the CO2, which then it goes back to the primary producers, and the whole cycle occurs, all right? So energy flows through, and chemicals cycle through like the carbon. Okay, so let's focus on energy here. Energy and other limiting factors control primary production. I used the word production yesterday in class. We're related to photosynthesis. So, primary production, the amount of light energy converted to chemical energy by autotrophs during a given period of time. So it could be like per year or something like that. So the amount of light energy converted to chemical energy, that's usually in what form? Chemical energy, like glucose, all right, through the process of photosynthesis. Few organisms, like I talked about, don't use light energy. Those are the chemoautotrophs. They would use a chemical energy and convert it into another type of chemical energy, into glucose. All right, so when we look at an ecosystem, the total amount of energy, they use the analogy of using what's called an energy budget. So the extent of photosynthetic production, so amount of photosynthesis, how much glucose are we making, sets the spending limit for an ecosystem's energy budget. So it's like a monetary budget. You have X amount of dollars, and then so the more money you have, the more money you can allot to various things, all right? So in this case here, the more production or the more photosynthesis you have, so if you have a lot of photosynthetic organisms and doing a lot of photosynthesis, it can support more organisms because that base is bigger, that source of energy. So that's what it means, sets the spending limit. So the more photosynthesis you can do, the more energy you have to work with in the ecosystem. So when we look at globally around the Earth as a whole, the amount of solar radiation reaching Earth's surface limits the photosynthetic output. So the radiation, the sun, regulates how much photosynthesis you could do. Only a small fraction of the solar energy actually strikes photosynthetic organisms, and even less is of a usable wavelength. So what happens? Here's your plant. Sunlight is shining down on the earth. Not all of that radiation from the sun actually even hits the plant. Why? Because our atmosphere filters out a lot. All right, so that's the first part of this. Atmosphere filters out a lot of that radiation. What the part that does hit the plant, the plant doesn't use all of it. So remember photosynthesis, when we talked about the electromagnetic radiation, visible light is only a small portion of that, the Roy G. Biv part, the rainbow part, and then plants, the chlorophyll A and the accessory pigments only use a small portion of even that visible light, so even less is of a usable wavelength. And so we're using just a small portion of the radiation, or the plants are, that get to the plant from the sun. So, and figuring out what's how much glucose a plant gets. There are two parts to this. Total primary production is known as the ecosystem's GPP, or gross primary production. GPP is measured as a conversion of chemical energy from photosynthesis per unit time. So that could be per year. Your net primary production is the GPP minus energy used by primary producers for cellular respiration. I'll talk about this in just a second here. And it's expressed in two different ways. The amount of energy that the plant makes per unit area. So energy is measured in joules per unit area. So let's be like per square meter, let's say. So how much energy is produced per square meter of this plant per unit time, so like let's say per year. Or another way to think about it is the biomass added per unit area per unit time. So biomass is grams. So let's talk about this and how it relates to this. Gross and net. I'm going to use an analogy with paychecks. How many people have a job or have had a job? All right. You, when you look at your pay stub, there's your gross pay and your net pay. All right. Can somebody tell me what the difference is between those? That's right. So gross is what you actually make, all right? So how many hours you worked multiplied by what you get paid per hour, and that's how much you actually earn. It is never what you actually take home. What you take home is when the government takes out taxes and so on, and then you get what's called your net after you take out all of those expenditures, all right? So we're gonna apply this to ecosystems. So when we look at gross primary productivity, gross, I'll just put GPP. This is all the photosynthesis that the plant does. So this is all the glucose that it makes, all right? So it's absorbing light, making glucose, and so on. But remember that when an organism eats the plant, they're not getting all the glucose that the plant has made, because the plant uses some of that glucose to actually live itself. And so when the plant makes the glucose, part of that is used, and that through what process? Cellular respiration. So therefore, if we take all the glucose it made minus the respiration, so this we could think of as, I'll write here, all the glucose made by the plant minus the glucose used by the plant. We call that difference the net primary production. This is the glucose left in the plant. So it's stored in some way, it's used to make other molecules and so on, but it's in the plant. And this is the glucose. And you can see here that this is increasing biomass because the plant now has more matter because it's storing glucose now, so it's increased the biomass. So now if an herbivore came to eat this plant, this is the glucose available to the herbivore, to the primary consumer. None of this would be available because it's been used up, all right? So some of that energy that was in the glucose has been used by the plant, a lot of it's been released as heat, and so on. And so that's what we mean by net. So this, when we think about it, it says energy per unit of time. We can measure this in the amount of energy in the glucose, or we can literally measure in grams how much glucose do we have here. All right, so that's what it means here. You can look at the energy or the mass itself, because every gram of glucose has a certain amount of energy in it. All right, so the NPP, or the net primary production, is the amount of new biomass added in a given time period. So that's this part here. The biomass is the glucose that's stored. The time period would be like a year. And only that net primary production is available to consumers to eat, and therefore be used for energy for the consumers. So areas that are most productive, tropical rainforests, estuaries are where fresh water meets salt water, and coral reefs are among the most productive ecosystems per unit area. Whereas marine ecosystems are relatively unproductive per unit area, but still contribute much to the global net primary production because of their size. So let's see here. If we use this, if you saw this sentence out of context, it wasn't in this notes about productivity. If you just saw a sentence that said, tropical rainforests are the most productive ecosystems, what should you be thinking about that in the head? What is that telling you, most productive about the ecosystem? It's most productive. What information do you know? What was that? Yeah, it has a higher GPP. So this, they do a lot of photosynthesis compared to respiration, so you have more energy available for your consumers. All right, so therefore, so that's what that means. And so notice here, it's usually in warmer tropical places and so on. So they're the most productive per unit area. Per unit area, so if you're looking at a square mile, mile by mile, we're looking at the GPP in there and calculating it. Marine ecosystems are unproductive per unit area compared to this. So if I were to take, marine means ocean. A lot of people think it means just any kind of water. It doesn't, it means ocean. All right, so you get a mile, square mile. So we're looking at unit area per unit area. This one's very productive. This one in that same area, not very productive. But we get a lot of our global productivity from oceans. Why? Because most of the earth is covered with oceans. So unit area to unit area, these land areas are better in terms of productivity, but overall, the ocean, we get a lot of productivity because of sheer size. All right? And so, so we can relate this then to a whole ecosystem. So ecosystems net productivity. So this is all the organisms in the whole ecosystem, not just looking at just kind of one organism. It's a measure of the total biomass accumulation during a given period. So this is the gross primary production minus the respiration of all the organisms. So it's all the producers minus all the respiration in a whole ecosystem, not just looking at one particular organism. And you can measure that by the flow of carbon dioxide and oxygen into and out of the ecosystem. Because remember, they're connected by photosynthesis, so that photosynthesis takes in oxygen and releases CO2. So overall, if you find that an ecosystem has a net release of oxygen, that tells you that it's storing CO2, because that's what, in glucose, that's what photosynthesis does. So you can measure O2 versus CO2 to get an idea of an estimate of its NEP. All right, so let's look at two types of ecosystems. And one is an aquatic ecosystem, the next one we're going to look at is a terrestrial. But the next couple slides are all about aquatic. So what affects this productivity in aquatic ecosystems, both marine and freshwater? Both light and nutrients control primary production. So light, if we're talking about like a lake, lakes and oceans, they're deep, they can be, And when the light hits the top, it goes through only a certain part of the lake. And then it filters out in the bottom of the ocean, doesn't get any light. So they call this the Photic Zone. This is, it receives light. So in an ocean, in a lake, it's usually areas that are most productive in a lake are near the shores, where seaweed and stuff like that can actually get light because it's not that deep. In the ocean, it's the first part of the, near the surface of the water. Usually there's algae, so algae does photosynthesis. There's phytoplankton, we talked a little bit about that yesterday. They float around with the current, but they do photosynthesis, and they're all in that photic zone near the surface of the lake, and they can do photosynthesis. So getting light is one thing. The more light you can get, the more GPP can happen, and the more glucose can ultimately be made. The second thing is nutrients. So nutrient limitation, more than light, nutrients limit primary productivity in most oceans and lakes. The definition of a limiting nutrient is the element that must be added for production to increase in an area. And nitrogen and phosphorus are the nutrients in marine ecosystems, ocean ecosystems that are often limit production. So an example is they did an experiment to figure out what the limiting nutrient was off the coast of New York here. They were looking at limiting phytoplankton. Phytoplankton, these guys are photosynthetic organisms, so they're producers. So basically in the ecosystem, the more producers you have, the more productive you can be, because the more producers, the more GPP you're going to have, and then the more net primary productivity. So what they did in their experiment, they took water, so notice here it says collection sites. So they took water from 7 different areas here, areas A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. Yours was fine. Mine didn't spread out when I converted it from PowerPoint to Google Slides. So this is G and F and so on and so forth. What they did, there's 3 bars for each collection site. So it has some water. In that water are some of the phytoplankton. And what they did, so phytoplankton are producers, remember? So these guys are producers. What's the relationship between producers and photosynthesis? The more producers you have, the more photosynthesis, right? And so what they did is at these 3 different sites, they collected water with phytoplankton, and then they added to the water one of 3 different things. So they had 3 parts to their experiment, three groups. The control, they didn't add anything. So it says unenriched, they didn't add any nutrients. One, they added phosphate. That's a source of phosphorus. Remember the phosphate groups. So, and then ammonium, this is a source of nitrogen. So let's write that. So you can see that the control group is purple. So this is the density of the phytoplankton. All right, so that's just there for a comparison. They didn't add any nutrients to that water. We looked at the phosphate one, the green. Phosphate didn't really grow. In fact, it didn't even grow as much as the unenriched one, the control. But then look at what happens with the ammonium. When they add the source of nitrogen, the phytoplankton density really went up, it skyrocketed. And if the phytoplankton goes up, what happens to the rate of photosynthesis, or the photosynthesis? It goes up as well. So we would say that when we add nitrogen, the productivity goes up. So therefore, nitrogen must be the limiting nutrient. By definition, the element that must be added for production, photosynthesis, to increase in an area. And that's what we have here. So when they added nitrogen, the phytoplankton went up, and so does productivity. So it must be the level of nitrogen in the water that limits the productivity. If you add nitrogen, that productivity will go up. All right? And so that's usually what controls amount of photosynthesis in aquatic organisms or aquatic ecosystems. So when you have nutrient-rich waters, like in the ocean, if you have pockets of nutrient-rich waters, you're going to have high primary production. And so we generally see that as you add nutrients, the production goes up to a certain point. So then it says here has a wide range of ecological impacts. If a lake has too much nutrients in, it can be detrimental. In some areas, and oftentimes nutrients get built up in lakes because of us, some kind of behavior that we've done. In some areas, sewage runoff causes what we call eutrophication of lakes, which lead to loss of most fish species. So in lakes, phosphorus limits cyanobacterial growth more than nitrogen, so it can be nitrogen or phosphorus. And this has led to the use of phosphate-free detergents. So what happens here, let's talk about these two and then I'll come back to this. Cyanobacterial, these guys are photosynthetic, so these guys are producers. So phosphorus limits the producer growth. So this can be a bad thing because you're limiting the producer growth. This has led to phosphate-free detergents. Most of the detergents that are sold, like for laundry detergents, dishwashing detergents, and so on, have phosphates in them. And so what happens is, as we use the water in our homes, that water eventually can make it back to lakes, rivers, and streams, and that phosphate, those phosphate levels continually get bigger and bigger and bigger, which then affects the producers here. And so some manufacturers have made phosphate-free detergents, so you don't, as you do these daily chores, you're not contributing to that problem. So that's what that means. Sewage runoff is a source of nutrients. It has nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus in sewage. Runoff means like if it rains and the ground becomes saturated, some of the water doesn't get absorbed then into the ground, and it runs downhill with gravity and pools in a lower spot, usually a lake, river, stream, pond, something like that. And also, when it rains, some of the groundwater actually gets to the lake as well. So sewage, if sewage has a lot of these nutrients, the nitrogen and phosphate can build up in lakes. Another thing that we talked about yesterday is when we artificially put nitrogen and phosphorus into our soil. What do we do that with? Fertilizers, right? So we fertilize, and then in the groundwater, that fertilizer gets to the lakes, and this process called eutrophication happens that leads to the loss of most fish species. I'm going to show you a little video. It's kind of silly, but it gives you the idea of why these fish species die off. So let's look at that real quick. I have it on mute because they don't really talk in it, and it plays annoying just music. So eutrophication here. Here comes the tractor with the fertilizer. So here's, told you it's silly. All right, but it gets the idea across. So the fertilizer, here's the fertilizer, rains, it dissolves. Some of that nitrogen and phosphorus is used by the grass. Some of it gets into the groundwater. So groundwater taking the nitrogen and phosphorus to the lake. All right, so here comes the fertilizer, nitrogen and phosphorus. Plants, seaweed and algae love it. So the algae, they start growing, they're growing like crazy. But look at the algae, it's called an algae bloom. It totally blocks the light from the seaweed down here. Seaweed then starts to die. Guess who loves that? Decomposers, bacteria. So the bacteria start feeding off the seaweed. They start dividing like crazy. Well, guess what they do? They use up all the oxygen in the lake. And guess who doesn't have any oxygen now? The poor little fishy.
Oh, no. Oh, and a bird.
So therefore, and that's eutrophication. So that's why excess.
That was really good. I had to wait because that was good. Elevator Mario too.
Yeah, the bacteria though would still, you couldn't be ongoing. That probably was. All right, guys. So we just have a little bit left to go. I guess I'll pick this up tomorrow. can.